the British and the Germans in the region, and I wasn't sure what it was, but it was this aerial perspective that really interested me. So then when I spent a year living in the old city of Jerusalem in 2009, teaching art and partly on a residency with Art School Palestine. And it was then that I met this Palestinian ornithologist, Sami Bakle, who's in the film, who told me that this is on one of the 2 biggest bird migration routes in the world. And somehow this aerial perspective and this sense of air and being above and floating and just not being in the confines of the camp, I felt was really important to pull out from that and try and show these people's condition, but also show what could be if we weren't so stupid on the ground with map making.
I mean, I have to sort of make admission of my own ignorance of not really fully understanding, the situation for a lot of these refugees, whether that's in the camps or more broadly. But how much were you already aware of, the situation in the camps, and also the fact of this UN resolution that's been reaffirmed so many times, the right to return and the right to compensation, and how much research did you have to go into, sort of beyond your interviews and the time spent with Fadia and her community?
Enormous number. I knew very, very little, and I'd never been in a refugee camp, and I'd never seen people living in conditions up close, quite, living amongst them. That was very humbling, and how people who would have nothing would give me something, would always want to give me they'd say, "Oh, you're British," and then they'd say, "Well, you would like a tea or a coffee or a Fanta or what would you like?" And that hospitality when you have nothing is that was incredibly moving. But I really knew very little, so I did have to do a lot of reading and research and talking to many people, and I spent a lot of time in the West Bank of Palestine, where I think perhaps I became educated there, but I knew very little myself in the beginning. So.
And the other thing that really stood out to me is that it's a very female-led film, and not only because you're telling Fadia's story, but also it's kind of through the prism of this friendship the 2 of you shared. You as a filmmaker, and of course then working with your producer. So on the one hand, I wondered if that presented any barriers to you, because I know that documentary filmmaking world is notoriously difficult to get into and can be very male-dominated. But then on the positive side, whether what do you think that brings to telling this story, the fact that it is through this female lens?
I think in a way it was such a solitary journey for me until I met Susan, the producer of the film, that I did a lot of funding applications, I did a lot of pitching at different festivals and things, and I felt it was more the subject matter that was holding it back than my sex. Perhaps that people wanted the film about the birds, there were TV people who said, "Why don't you just make a film about the birds?" And I said, "Well, that's not why I'm making this film. I'm making this film because it's about Fadia and her community." And so there was that. There was the subject matter to get over more than anything, I think. But yeah, I think it does have a very female sensibility, and that we formed a sisterly friendship, which is we talk to each other at least once a week still, and we're very close. And the whole team during post-production, really the close editing team was me, Susan, and our editor Ariadna Fatio-Vilas. So there was it was all female perspective, except in the sound department, I have to say, which we do have to say, amazing sound by Palestinian hip-hop artist and electronic composer Makata, who did the score from scratch, and Stefan Smith, who did an amazing job with the sound design. So.
And of course it's Fadia's story, but it's not only Fadia's story, and it's of course reflective of a reality that a lot of people are living, whether that's Palestinian refugees or refugees from other crises around the world, most recently perhaps what's happening in the Ukraine. So to what extent do you see the power of cinema, the power of documentary film to kind of get behind some of the headlines that perhaps we've all become a bit desensitized to, and how kind of telling these human stories can really foster empathy and hopefully precipitate change in the long term?
Yeah, that's very beautifully said. I think the slowing down that people have to do when they're trapped in a dark room of a cinema is you can't just flick channels, you can't just walk off and make a cup of tea. I think that's important and allows you to properly engage with what you've got on screen, and I think that is the power of cinema, is that suspension of your body, or almost in you share a common body in the room at the cinema, and it does allow you to open your mind and have these flickering images that can go in a different way, I think, than if you're on TV with a remote, or you're on a computer, or you're swiping on your phone. So I still think, cinema, you can't really beat it.
And I'm going to shut up in a minute. Just one more question, which is, it's obviously not your first time, I think, seeing it on the big screen. In fact, you have Fadia over here in London, I believe. But what does it mean to you, the fact that it is getting a cinema release, and that it's been recognised by like Amnesty International, for example, and hopefully more and more people are going to be able to see this on the big screen?
I think it means an enormous amount to me because of the subject matter that it is about, and because I kind of spent years in the wilderness just thinking, how can I personally solve the situation in the Middle East? And obviously I couldn't, but the fact that this film has got this level of traction and that Colin took it on, and it is now going to cinemas all around the UK, from Belfast to Inverness to Cardiff to all over, is huge, I think, in terms of rekindling some interest in a tragic situation that has been overlooked for a long time, and these people have just, nothing has happened to improve their lives in 74 years. That's not all right, and they are the biggest body of people who are held in this limbo for the longest period of time, and something needs to change. So
just one thing that I just remembered you telling me as well, that they don't even have fresh water, is that right?
No,
so something even as basic as that?
Yeah, they have to buy drinking water and use that water for cooking because it's disgusting, salinated, sort of chemically treated water that makes your skin go all wrinkly in seconds. It's really not, it's very awful.
Well, I think now, should we open up to the audience? I don't know if anybody has a question they'd like to ask. Michelle?
Hello everyone, are you out there?
I'll ask a question. Oh, sorry.
I have two questions.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, two questions if I may. One, how do you know that was Fadia's tree? And two, does Fadia have any hope of getting out of the camp? Is she resigned to being there until the end of the day?
Well, the first one, it was very clear. I basically, Southside is a very small place. I walked every single street of Southside. I literally, I sort of had a thing and I sort of marked off all the bits where I'd been. And in the very beginning, she tells me the house is in the east. And it gets really confused because all these other relatives come in with their inherited memories, and then maybe it's in the west or the south, or it was just clear that it's a very ancient tree. And when I was there, actually an Israeli woman appeared with a group of people to show off this tree, which is 800 years old, that sort of spreads. It's not a single trunk, it has lots of trunks. So luckily, there was a moment when I found a giant picnic table made out of a tree, enormous tree trunk, and I thought, oh my God, that's it. But luckily it wasn't. And I mean, it's it just is that tree. That's the best I can do for that, but it's in the right place. It's an ancient tree, and also the signs of the shrine were there. The votive offerings of pieces of clay, and where they would have set up a light to have their wishes answered, the women of the village. There were all kinds of traces around the tree that made it very clear it had been at a sacred spot. And the second question is that I think that Fadia cannot leave now because she is so embedded in her community. They look to her for so many things. I mean, she's just constantly evolving the school into being, now it has a library, she started a theatre, she has the Women of the Camp theatre. She's doing a clothing exchange thing on a Saturday morning. I mean, it's just endless, the things she dreams up to try and alleviate some of the poverty and difficulties that everybody's facing. So I don't think she would ever be able to walk away from that now. So I think, yeah.
Did you want to ask?
Thank you. I thought it was such a beautiful film, and I loved how slow it was and pensive and deliberate, and it felt very, very artistic, so it makes sense that you have a very artistic background. And it also resonated with me because my father's village, which is destroyed, is actually also off the Route 90. And when I went to go and find it, I spent a long time looking over Lake Tiberias before I managed to find it. And it's on the border with Jordan, and so many of the photos and videos we took of that time have exactly the same sort of bifurcation of space as between Lebanon and Palestine, and we sort of had the same experience. In fact, you could even hear the adhan, the call to prayer from Jordan, from where the village used to be, which is now a kibbutz. So I thought it was beautiful, and I loved the metaphor of the bird, and I loved the kind of how it wasn't the house or the school or the mosque or the church which was the return for her, but it was the tree, and that idea of nature remembering and nature keeping the school felt very, very beautifully conveyed. I'd like to ask about maps and the aerial photographs that were in there as well. So I'm currently doing my PhD on maps of Palestine, and spend a lot of my time looking at these maps and the kind of gerrymandering that goes into making them. And I know as well, you know, the satellite imagery that you showed in SatSat, all of the political reasons as to why that is to deliberately obfuscate Palestinians and others from finding detailed imagery of remnants and things that were once taken. So I'm just curious as to when you went back into wanting to explain a certain history and deploy either Google Maps or I don't know what the aerial imagery was from, but either German or British wartime imagery, I think. How did you decide what went in? How could you find a way to convey meaning? Because obviously you also want to make sure your audience is keeping up and the gravity of it's coming clear, and what challenges came up when you were deciding how to convey cartography through film. And then if I can, actually, just a last question that occurred to me. One of my favourite bits of the film was the interview with Abu Jahed, and this idea of this blind man who once saw and can now no longer see, giving her a perfect map of how to return, and that as a form of counter-cartography, right, decolonial counter-cartography from refugees back to their homeland. So this contrast between the sort of Cartesian map, which is portrayed through satellite imagery and through aerial photography, and then the counter map, which is an oral tradition, which is kind of kept in the mouths of the young from generation to generation. And yeah, any thoughts on mapping would be great. I'd love to hear them. Thank you.
Oh goodness, what a question. Yes, it's a very good question. I did a lot of research into different maps and different ways of looking from the air, and I did want to attach a camera to a stalk at one point, and I wrote to various people working on migration in from Africa all the way to, but I didn't get very far with that. So, and I used a drone, and I hated the drone footage. It just didn't feel like a bird. It just felt cold, and you know that you can't get a sort of rocking drone. Is what I think you probably can now, but you couldn't when I was trying. There were certain black and white images that, so I looked in the Imperial War Museum. I looked, but mostly online in the Commons. I mean, the UK, the US Library of Congress. That's really where most of these images have come from. I was fascinated by the Google, and we went up a lot of avenues within the edit because on Google World, for instance, you can fly a fighter jet, to have an experience of mapping from a fighter jet. I think there's there are two options of what you're going to fly in, and one just happens to be an F-15, and you just think, why? But also zooming in, because I really wanted, there is a sequence where Fadia says at the end, I can't ever think it's not there, and I'm going closer and closer in to an image which which pixelates. It's not actually an aerial image, but I was just really interested in how on Google Maps, as you approach the Israeli border, the distinction completely shifts. And there's a very hard line. In Lebanon, you can go really close, you can zoom right in, and you can see all the individual houses. But as you approach the border with Israel, the clarity is very different. So, I did a lot of doing the flying, not in the F-16, but trying to sort of fly and hit that area of blur and lack of distinction. But it was hard that wasn't really conveying without having to spell it out somehow. So what else? I was fascinated by how some men in suits in Europe could draw lines across people's families, tribes, destinies, and they didn't even bother to sharpen those pencils. I mean, there's just it's so, someone could be such a thick, clumsy line. It's like, which side of that line are you? Obviously it was drawn in a more detailed way later on, but still, there's just a sort of carelessness to it that I found really shocking. So I don't know really what else to say, except the birds were my way of doing one kind of mapping. But yes, the memory mapping, I think, is what people hold on to, is so important, and counteracts all the colonial mapping, because there are no lines and no borders in that memory. Yeah.
Another question?
Hi, I'm not doing a PhD in Palestinian maps, although that will sound fascinating. I'm interested in the story choices that you made, and when it became apparent to you that birds was going to be this amazing metaphor to convey the story, and it actually has so much emotion. You kind of were so used to seeing and kind of having the stereotypes of refugees, but then if you bring that in, and it kind of sheds a new light on it. So when did you decide that was going to be something you would explore? And was there anything did you have any other choices that you thought, no, that's not going to work, and this is the one for this story, other than obviously the wonderful metaphor of the tree?
Yes, there were other thoughts of how to do it. Mythology was one, actually. I was very interested I am very interested in myth, but there was still a bird involved, but there's the Egyptian myth of Isis and Osiris, and Isis takes the form of a bird when her husband Osiris is chopped into 28 pieces, maybe 13 pieces, my lucky number, and spread all across the land, and she becomes a hawk, and she captures the pieces of the broken body and brings them together, and with the flapping of her wings she breathes life back into the body. So I sort of went along that way for a bit, but then that just became too esoteric and far away from Fadia. So, but it was very clear that the birds, because I was interested in the aerial perspective and the mapping, and that as soon as I heard the importance of birds in the region, I felt that was and how the trajectory of the birds seemed to be able to reconnect people and place that had been separated and fragmented. I didn't then need the Egyptian myth. They were already doing it. They were already gently flapping between people who wanted to be somewhere but couldn't, and they were gathering up all these places and people in their wake somehow. And it just seemed clear that they were what were needed.
I don't know if we got time for one more.
Tony, you were.
Oh.
You had some images of the family of Fadia, the sons, and then it said at the end they'd also become parents themselves. And I was just wondering whether you picked up from them that there was an equal commitment to hang on in there and sort of campaign or fight to reclaim their own homeland, or is that determination, in your perception, less so than it is for Fadia? Is there an inclination to look to Europe or elsewhere, or is there still that, subsequent generations wanting to stay put and fight to get back to where their descendants had been? What is the comparison, if there is a strict comparison?
I don't think there is a simple generational comparison, because there are still young men who are prepared to fight. And there are others who, Fadia's daughter, Samud, Samud means resistance in Arabic. She just says, tear down the camps in Lebanon. Lebanon is the only place where the camps are, where the people do not have citizenship and are not eligible to have citizenship. So she says, tear down the camps and give them citizenship and let us get on with our lives. Don't treat people, leave them in prisons like this. But then there are others who feel that if they accept the citizenship, it's going to diminish the strength of their right of return. So there's no this or that, but yes, for the older generation, or the oldest generation, who still remember their homes in Palestine, that's it's very strong, that sense of huge injustice, and to get back to what they lost, or to get compensation for what they lost at the very least, neither of which have been honoured.
I think that's all we have time for, unless there was one more.
He was trying in
Right
the
at the
beginning.
beginning.
You're still up for it.
Go for it.
The great thing about going last is that everyone asks the questions you're going to ask. I was really interested in the mapping thing. First of all, thanks, along with everyone else, for that beautiful film. And I really share your feelings about the slowness of it, which was so great, whether you were looking at your fascination with these wires down the alleyways, or the birds, or whatever it was. You just had time to sort of spend with those. And I was really interested in, this is a film that you were making about 15, 17 years, something like this. So I was really, really interested about how you found this film, and what sort of role the editing played in finding this film, or how did you figure it out? Were you trying to put things together as you were going along over the 15 years? Did it was really to do with the editing and the part that played in the making of the film.
Huge is what I can say. Huge, because I had these two elements. I had over 400 hours of footage, and I had all this stuff of Fadia. I had so many other parts in the camp, of different characters, different people in the camp. Little cameos that could possibly have been included, but it just became clear to all of us, I think, that we needed. The tree wasn't very high up on the list of things in the beginning. But I actually didn't find the tree till really late on. It was like really at the end. About 6 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, something like that. So the tree was kind of like, oh God, no, not, do I really have to try and find the tree? Isn't there some other way to make this film? So the tree was, yeah, but it became clear that the tree was a way of the tree was the resistance. The tree was the member of the family who'd stayed behind. The tree was the archive, the living archive, still living archive somehow of a community, a family, particularly Fadia's family, who associate so strongly. But yeah, it was really, I have to give Ariadna Fatja-Vilas enormous credit for her patience in working through all those hours and sifting through. And we had, I mean, I sat beside her for almost all of the time. We had billions of post-it notes. We would shuffle around on the board, and Susan would come in to look at a rough cut, and I think she'd look with horror at how it had all changed from the last time she'd been, and then we'd have long discussions, and then she'd come a few days running to check we were on track. So it was very slow, almost as slow as the making of the film was the finding of the film, I think.
And one last question. Had you not found the tree, what would you have said to Fadia?
Again, I think it's about memory mapping. I think it wouldn't have been the end of the world because it's so strong in her mind, and that she holds it there, having never seen it, that whether anyone saw it or not, her belief system would not be challenged by that, I don't think.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. But just one thing I wanted to also bring up, because you haven't been put off, I think, completely from making documentary films. And in fact, you were telling me something great about the inspiration you've had for your next one. I think when Fadia had come to stay, you'd been on a farmhouse. Is that right? Maybe you just want to say a bit of word about your potential next project?
Yes, I was really hoping to have quite a relatively quiet summer, just going around the country doing Q&As and not doing much else, but Fadia has a huge thing for the book Wuthering Heights and the Brontes. And Wuthering Heights sustained her during terrible times in the camp when bombs were falling, and she really wanted to go to Haworth in Yorkshire, and so off we went to Haworth, and it was amazing. We had an amazing time. In the church we found this enormous patchwork quilt of people who had embroidered little messages to Palestine. So she was, it was just almost like it was waiting for her there. It was quite extraordinary. But then I'd never been to the Lake District, which was nearby, and I said, you know, do you fancy seeing another part of England? She did, of course. So we stayed on a sheep farm for 3 days, and at the end of which I discovered that the farmer was going to be leaving after 50 years at the end of the summer. And I've always been interested in sheep that are hefted to the landscape. That means that they teach their baby sheep, they teach which area of the common land on top of the fell is theirs to roam in. And it's this very close relationship with landscape. I grew up in a very rural place, that I've always been fascinated by how humans and other species connect with place, I suppose. So I felt there was something to explore there. So I've started, since Fadia's gone back to Lebanon, but I have been back to the farm twice now, filming. So that's...
Sounds like the start of another fascinating journey. Hopefully not another 15-year one. Well, I think on that note, I'll just say a huge thanks and congratulations to you again. Thank you for showing all those wonderful insights with us and for making this really unique, beautifully made and incredibly moving documentary. And thanks to you all again for coming and for your really wonderful questions. So.